I am happy to introduce Sister Sheila Carney to speak with us this evening. Sister Sheila will share stories and reflections about the charism and mission of Catherine McAuley and its relevance to Mercy education. Sister Sheila has served her community and the local and national church in a wide variety of positions, from teaching in elementary school to serving in regional and national leadership. She is currently on the staff at Carlow University, her alma mater, as a special assistant to the president for Mercy Heritage, a position she has held for 11 years. Currently, she is a board member of McAuley Ministries and of Mercy International Association. She serves as the vice postulator.
Postulator.
I practiced too. Postulator for the cause of the canonization of Catherine McAuley. Sister Sheila is an internationally known speaker and a retreat director and the co-author of Praying with Catherine McAuley. Sister, thank you again for joining us this evening, and I will turn this over to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Susan. I'm delighted to be with you tonight, just crawling out of COVID. And my last remaining symptom is coughing fits, which I lapse into occasionally. So I want to begin this evening by apologizing for the voice that you're going to have to listen to, and for the fact that I may occasionally just have to break off and get myself back together again. But we hope that won't happen tonight. When Kim and Susan invited me to do this presentation, we talked about it in terms of kind of two bodies of material. And one was the life and times of Catherine McAuley, and the other was Catherine McAuley as a leader. And we decided that because there is so much readily available about the life of Catherine McAuley, that I wouldn't focus so much on that. But I still ended up with two parts to this presentation. The first is I'm going to spend some time talking about why education is important to the Sisters of Mercy and how we see that in the early community, how we see that in the life of Catherine McAuley and those early sisters. And then in the second part, we're going to hear some stories about Catherine that are illustrative of the leader that she was. I like to refer to Catherine as leading from a merciful space. So we're going to talk a little bit about what defined that space in her. But before we do either of those things, I want to cite a paragraph from the Constitution of the Sisters of Mercy, which is our rule of life, the document by which we live, which says, by collaborating with others in the works of mercy, we continually learn from them how to be more merciful. I love that paragraph because it speaks to the wealth of relationships among all of us who are involved in ministries of mercy, that the Sisters of Mercy have something to bring to that, but all of our lay collaborators have gifts and insights and wisdom that they bring to it as well. So we're continually learning from one another how we experience and understand a merciful God and how we live that out in our own lives. So I start this evening by thanking you for your collaboration with us in this ministry of mercy, which has been with us from even before the Sisters of Mercy were founded. I say that because Catherine McAuley's involvement in education actually goes back to the time when she was really a toddler, because early in her life, she accompanied and probably participated in classes that her father held for children who were living in poverty. He had a very great concern for those children and wanted to be sure that especially they had an opportunity to learn about their religion. And so he would gather little groups of children in a tree, around a tree in their front yard, and teach them their lessons. And Catherine was only 5 when he died, but we understand the dramatic effect that his example had on her, because she did exactly the same thing when she had the opportunity. When she was a young adult, she was living with a couple whose names were William and Catherine Callahan. They had invited her to come and live with them as a companion to Catherine Callahan. And during those years, she noticed around her 2 different groups. One were little children living in poverty, whom she gathered around a tree in front of that house, Kulak House, and taught them their religion. And then another group were young girls who were not in school and who were just kind of loitering around Kulak Village. And she taught them needlework. She gave them a skill, and she opened a little boutique in the city to sell the things that they were making. So the kind of characteristic of the Sisters of Mercy about the empowerment of women comes from all the way back in her life to this moment, when she determined that what she wanted to do with her life was to create opportunities for women to be self-determining, to give them the skills that they needed to be the authors of their own lives. So Catherine spent 20 years with the Callahans, and those were not years of simply waiting and serving, but also of honing her own skills. And there were a lot of skills that she amassed during these years. Catherine Callahan had a chronic illness, and her husband was an apothecary. And so he taught Catherine McAuley the skills of what we would call home nursing. She learned how to manage a large household. She learned how to hire and train and supervise staff. She learned estate management as William Callahan grew older. And when the Callahans died and Catherine found herself amazingly the heir to their fortune, all of those skills came to bear on what she did at that point. William Callahan had said to her one day, "If I left you a little bit of money, what would you do with it?" And she said, "I'd buy a house and take in women like myself." And by that, she meant women who had no resources of their own and no skills. We would call this transitional housing. You know, everything that she did is mirrored in some ministries that we're carrying on today under different titles. She was going to teach them to be domestic servants, which doesn't sound great to us, but was a really good, secure job in those days. So he left her a little bit of money, and then through a variety of circumstances, she ended up being the heir to his fortune. And so she took that little dream and she made it as big as the money would buy. And she bought a piece of property and she built a great big building. And the first thing that she did was open it as a school. So initially, about 200 little girls, little barefoot girls, would show up in this house every day to be educated. And in an era when people learned by apprenticeship, she apprenticed herself in several educational circumstances. She became a regular instructor at the St. Mary's Poor School. She visited the Kildare Society schools, in which she observed that Catholic children were proselytized and ridiculed for practicing their faith. And she traveled to France, because in France they had the latest pedagogical methods, and she wanted the school that she had for the children who were poor to be excellent schools.
Sheila,
was
her travel to France in between her opening the House of Mercy and her entering and creating the community, or was that later?
No, I think it was actually earlier, and I just forgot to say it. Yeah.
Okay.
So there was a 3-year period between her inheriting the Callahan estate and the settling of the will, because relatives contested the will.
Right. Okay.
So during that period of time is when she was preparing herself to be an educator.
Thank you.
Yeah. She was determined to offer an education that was second to none in terms of the development of the students' intellectual abilities and their religious faith. In a letter that's dated September 1828, which is 1 year after the House of Mercy opened, Catherine wrote about the purposes for which she had created it. She says, "The objects which the charity at present embrace are the daily education of hundreds of poor female children and the instruction of young women who sleep in the house." In fact, an early manuscript noted that 500 girls daily experience the blessing of instruction in that house. 4 years after the opening of the House of Mercy, Catherine McAuley and 2 of her companions professed their vows at the Presentation Convent in Dublin, thus establishing the Sisters of Mercy. And while the ministries at the Convent of Mercy in Dublin remained central to her heart, she soon found herself besieged by priests and bishops from all over Ireland to establish groups of Sisters of Mercy in their towns and dioceses. So in her lifetime, she only lived for 10 years as a Sister of Mercy. But in that lifetime, she founded 7 Mercy convents in Ireland and 2 in England. And there was a pattern to what she did. In each place that they went, they did 2 things immediately. They began to visit persons living in poverty who were experiencing illness, the sick poor, as she called them, and they established a school for children living in poverty. Then they sort of stepped back and got to know what the local circumstances were. So Catherine says each place has its own peculiarities, which must be yielded to. But notice that always these 2 things, the visitation of the sick in their homes and the education of children who are poor. Let's see. The schools that the Sisters of Mercy founded were run according to what was called the monetarist system, which she had learned in France. And according to this system, there was one master teacher who kind of sat on a dais at the end of the classroom, and lots of little groups who were gathered around less professionally trained teachers who drilled them in their lessons. And then they would go up and recite to the head teacher. So these were the kind of schools that Catherine began to establish in each of her foundations. And there's an interesting point here. In a letter that she wrote to Mary Ann Doyle in 1840, she said, "Would it not be better to try to get a well-qualified monitress from the model school until your sisters know the methods? I think they could send you one. She should be paid a small salary out of what the Board of Education allows." This is important because the sisters were not paid for their efforts, but Catherine believed it was a matter of justice to pay their lay collaborators for the work that they did in the Mercy schools. There are 2 other vignettes I'd like to include in this exploration of Catherine's educational efforts. And the first involves the establishment of the house at Kingston, which is a little town on the seacoast just north of Dublin. It's called Dunleary now. If you've been to Ireland, you may be familiar with the name Dunleary. This house was given to the sisters as a place where members who were ill could recuperate. So there wasn't supposed to be any ministry in that house. Just sisters would go there, they would get well, and they would come back to their ministry. But I always like to say, poor Catherine McAuley, she was helpless in the face of need. So she was visiting Kingston and discovered again groups of young girls who had nothing to do, no skills, no education. And she went to the parish priest and said that she would be glad to give the carriage house to create a school in Kingston. And so she did. And this episode is a long and kind of complicated episode in Catherine's life because she told the priest she didn't have the money to pay for this. And he agreed to raise the money to do it, and then reneged, and the contractor sued Catherine. So they had to, eventually they ended up removing the sisters from Kingston, but then almost immediately began to negotiate for them to go back. And from this episode, we hear Catherine say, "God knows I'd rather be cold and hungry than that the poor in Kingston be deprived of any consoling in my power to offer them." So even though she felt they were being treated unjustly, and indeed they had to sell the house to pay the debt, they immediately began to negotiate to go back because their hearts had been captured by the poor of Kingston. The other story has to do with Carlo, and this is a story that's very important in the educational history in our country, because it has to do with the fact that when the Sisters of Mercy went to Carlo in 1837, there was already a group of presentation sisters in the town, and they had a school for children who were poor. And so it would have been poor form for the Sisters of Mercy to ride in on their white horses and establish their own poor school. And so Frances Ward, who was the leader in Carlo, puzzled over that for a while. And what she came to realize was that the group in need in Carlo were the middle class. Wealthy people sent their children away to boarding school. The poor were being cared for by the presentation sisters, but it was the children of the middle class who formed a bridge between the other two groups who needed education. And so she and Catherine had a long negotiation about this and eventually agreed that it would be proper for the Sisters of Mercy to run a pension school, which is a school that charged tuition. So that's the school that was established in Carlo and that still exists there. St. Leo's in Carlo is an amazing school for girls in the middle of the town. And the money that was collected from the children going to that school was used to subsidize the ministries to the poor. So it wasn't income to the sisters, but it was a subsidy for their ministries. But every academy in the United States owes its beginning to this negotiation between Catherine and Frances over whether they could open a pension school in Carlo. And there was, in fact, a little mini Mercy War that went on when Frances, what was her name? Baptist Russell came to California and took the position that academies were not proper mercy ministries. And this correspondence went on between her and Frances Ward and Frances Bridgman in Ireland until they finally agreed that because Catherine had consented to it, it was an appropriate ministry. Angela Bolster, who was for a long time the postulator for the cause of Catherine McAuley, wrote a very long document in support of Catherine's holiness called the Positio. And in the Positio, she writes that Catherine created an educational system permeated by religion in which minds developed and characters formed through holy, gentle, and affirming influences. Isn't that a wonderful kind of description for the work that we do with our children in our Mercy schools? Holy, gentle, and affirming influences. Catherine often said that to the sisters, that sighing and being often on their knees wasn't much use if they didn't turn their prayers into action. And she taught the sisters that the prayers that they made every morning had to be turned immediately into some practical action. And she and that becomes kind of a basis for her approach to prayer in the schools. In a little book entitled Thoughts from the Spiritual Instructions of Catherine McAuley, she's quoted as saying, "We must be vigilant in the service of the children under our care, having a watchful eye over them, that we may form their hearts and minds to piety and infuse into them a desire to please God in all their actions." For her, prayer and action were never separated. And again, in the Positio, Angela Bolster writes that in Catherine's schools, religious instruction was to be the touchstone for the day. The idea here was to accustom the pupils to associate their ordinary work with their religion and to train them to a sense of justice toward God as well as to their neighbors. She wanted for her students, as well as for her sisters, a rich personal relationship with God, which overflowed in acts of mercy for God's people. One thing that really touched me when I was doing some reading in preparation for this was Catherine's approach to preparation for the sacraments, which she took very seriously. And let me read one letter that she wrote to Mary Elizabeth Moore as an example. I trust in God you all continue well and happy. I suppose you are preparing your poor children for confirmation. You will not forget to make them repeat the hymn often and the ejaculatory prayers we used. Make them understand well the nature of the sacrament, the gift and graces it imparts, which depends so much on the preparation. To impress particularly the great necessity of a pious, good preparation, as the sacrament can be received but once, and that if the benefit is lost now, they can never receive it again. I always found this produced good effect. Do all you can to get them to understand the nature of the retreat for 10 days before. Tell them how far they can practice it, but above all, constant fervent prayer. So, the children are to practice the hymns, they are to practice the prayers, they are to understand that this is a one-time event in their life that requires serious preparation. They have a 10-day retreat before confirmation, all as flowing out of Catherine's conviction of the importance of this in the life of the children. One other piece that I found kind of humorous was that she's talking about a sister who was ill, and she said she was preparing the children in the school for confirmation and made too much exertion. She burst the blood vessel. On another occasion, Catherine reports that her funds are low because the sisters have purchased dresses for all 100 students who are being confirmed. For me, there is in these details such a care for students, not only that they learn the doctrine around the sacraments they are received, but that they appreciate its power and its meaning in their lives. And the purchase of the new dresses on this and on other occasions speaks to me of respect for the moment and of the beauty of the ritual which will surround the sacrament. Because the children are poor does not mean that this should not be a meaningful and lovely moment in their lives. This concern for the spiritual formation of children is particularly evident in the rule of life that Catherine wrote for the sisters. The first 2 chapters of the rule have to do with the educational ministry. Think about that. The first 2 chapters, they're not dedicated to the vows or to community life, but they're dedicated to the ministry of education. Chapter 1 deals with what she calls the objects of the Institute, among which she includes the instruction of poor girls. The second paragraph of this chapter is lovely. It reads, "In undertaking the arduous but very meritorious duty of instructing the poor, the sisters shall animate their zeal and fervor by the example of their divine Master Jesus Christ, who testified on all occasions a tender love for the poor." So while acknowledging the arduousness of teaching, Catherine nevertheless encourages zeal and fervor in this ministry and offers the person of Jesus as the example. Not only because Jesus loved and saved the poor, but because in serving them we serve him. The second chapter of the rule, titled "Of the Schools," is interesting. Again, Catherine addresses the qualities of those called to the ministry of education. The sisters shall with all zeal, charity, humility, purity of intention, and confidence in God undertake the charge and cheerfully submit to every labor and fatigue annexed thereto. She was not unaware of the physical and psychological demands of the educational ministry. This paragraph is about attitude, about how we come to the classroom, how we come to each encounter with a student or another member of the faculty or staff. It's an acknowledgement that the work of education is hard, accompanied by the suggestion that the mental framework with which we approach it can lighten it for us and for those with whom and for whom we engage in this ministry. In the next 3 paragraphs, Catherine outlines the kinds of religious instruction that should be characteristic of the schools. First of all, before the sisters enter school, they shall raise their hearts to God and to the Queen of Heaven, recommending themselves and the children to their care and protection. We're called here to prepare ourselves for ministry by taking time for prayer for ourselves and for our students. And thus, she says to the sisters, having prepared themselves for the day, she lists this whole list of religious practices that are to be woven into the instruction throughout the day. Different kinds of devotions, different kinds of prayer. Every day at 11:45, silence and the examination of conscience. It's a pretty heavy list, and it's not devotions that we involve in our curriculum any longer. But the point is not, I think, that these devotions are especially significant. What Catherine is describing, what she's asking to be created in the schools which bear the Mercy name, is an environment where religious education is central to the experience and where students learn also through example and through instruction what it means to live in faith. Students learn dogma, but they also learn the discipline of religion, if you will. What we believe, yes, and also how a person of belief makes his or her way through life. What she's asking for here is an environment where there is no split between what one is taught and what one observes. Let's stop here for a minute to consider what these stories reveal about what it is that Catherine calls us to. The noticing of need. Being aware of the circumstance in which she found herself and the persons who were in need of ministry. Being willing to bend to meet particular circumstances. We saw that in the story of Carlo. Excellence in the preparation of teachers. Borrow a monitor from a school where they're already established and invite them to come and teach your teachers. Respect for lay collaborators and their needs, the paying of the monitresses. The importance of religious education pervading the school experience. Finding and standing with students and colleagues where they are and discovering ways to respect one another's beliefs and opinions. The importance of acknowledging the privilege of the call to the ministry of education by beginning each day with prayer, thanking God for this opportunity and holding up to God the students entrusted to our care and the colleagues who share this ministry with us. It's a demanding but a wonderful set of challenges to which she calls us, characteristics perhaps of the schools that we have created in her name. Catherine McAuley, after much prayer, agreed to found a religious community in order to give permanence to the work she had begun. And this is so clearly seen in the Ministry of Education, which has been with us, been the very heart of the Mercy congregation since before the community was established. It was all the way back in a concretized way, all the way back to 1827. In 1843, the first sisters left Carlo and came to the United States, here to Pittsburgh, and began a Mercy school here. And This was followed over the next 49 years by 9 other founding groups coming from different places in Ireland and England and spreading throughout this country and throughout Jamaica, Guyana, and Argentina. In each of these founding places, and in each place they in turn founded, the pattern was the same. The sisters arrived, and within days, a school was in operation. These schools were almost always located in the convent because there wasn't any other place to have them. In some cases, they were pretty makeshift accommodations. In Titusville, for instance, the sisters founded a school within days of their arrival for 400 children in the convent yard. I can't remember where this was, but I remember the story of one school that was in the basement of the church, and the walls between the classrooms were the coal that had been brought in for the winter. So as the winter went on, the walls came down and the sisters had to accommodate to the fact that they were now in a big open classroom. These schools had no books. They had scant supplies and furniture, no financial resources. But what they did have was a group of inspired and inspiring educators dedicated to justice as a means of empowerment. And they understood and lived Francis Ward's oft-quoted maxim, to instruct is an easy matter, but to educate requires ingenuity, energy, and perseverance without end. The success and the longevity of these schools, so fragile in their beginnings, is a testament to this energy, ingenuity, and perseverance, and is a phenomenon within our history. Our ongoing commitment to the ministry of education is grounded in the constitutions of the Sisters of Mercy of the Americas. In the opening paragraphs of this self-descriptive document, we say, through direct service and through our influence, we seek to relieve ministry and to address its causes and to support all persons who struggle for full dignity. To this end, we serve God's people through education, healthcare, and other ministries that further social, political, economic, and spiritual well-being. These are paragraphs 3 and 4. Like Catherine McAuley, we have placed our ministries, education among them, at the very beginning of this document that says who we are and to what we devote our lives. I want to tell you a couple of stories that illustrate for me, just to kind of round out this piece about what our Mercy Schools stand for, what their history is, what they stand for, coming from the example of Catherine McAuley, and who are the people that we hope are ministering them in them. I want to tell you 3 stories. And these are stories about the hopes of the Sisters of Mercy for our lay collaborators. So the first one is a story that I know you've all experienced, and it has to do with going out to eat. Isn't it going to be wonderful when we can go out to eat again? Well, you know what it's like when you go into a restaurant, and particularly a restaurant that has really interesting things on the menu, and they list what the ingredients are, and sometimes there are ingredients that you're not familiar with. And so the waiter comes over and you say, can you talk a little bit about this? And the waiter launches into this luscious description of what this dish is. And then maybe tells you about some of the other dishes on the menu, and then maybe says, I'd steer away from these. You know how much that adds to your anticipation of and enjoyment of the meal when it has been introduced to you by somebody who has enjoyed it and savored it. That's what we hope for the leaders in our Mercy Schools, that you have savored and enjoyed and tasted the ingredients of our Mercy heritage. the story of Catherine McAuley, the founders of the school in which you serve, the history of the school itself, that you know those stories well enough to tell them enthusiastically and enticingly to the people with whom you work and to the people whom we're drawing to our schools. A second story has to do with this is an old one. The death of one of our sisters, and the moment when her body was being brought back to the mother house to be waked. And we have a ramp at the back of our mother house for such an occasion. But it happens that the sister was obese and she had a large coffin which wouldn't fit through the door where the ramp was. And so we had to bring her around to the front of the convent where there is a double door that could be opened, but it's up about 10 steps. So we're walking along the pathway, and I noticed standing on the porch of one of the college buildings, a gentleman just standing there watching us. And I got it at the head of the procession and went into the building. And when the coffin came into the building, that gentleman was helping to carry it. And when it was situated, he just turned around and walked back out of the building again. And a couple of days later, I ran into him on the campus. And I was thanking him for the sensitivity and the generosity of his assistance in our ministry of burying the dead. And then we got to the point of introducing one another, and I discovered that he was the new public relations director for the university. And, you know, we made an appointment to talk more about our Mercy heritage. But my point here is that even before he knew the story, he exuded it. You know, it was a wonderful moment to know that this was the person who was going to be telling who we were. Because in that sensitivity, he had already exhibited the fact that he understood. Schools are founded so that persons can learn basic skills and can be introduced to the experience of loving learning. But the Sisters of Mercy bring to our schools the additional purpose of extending mercy where needed, of engendering in students a sensitivity to the needs of the world and a commitment to serving in ways to alleviate those needs. So as you stand for us as a leader in a mercy school, we hope that you'll model mercy in ways that are clear and identifiable, and that you'll hone your own merciful spirit in your personal and professional life. And the last story has to do with a nail, which I was not able to locate, or I would hold it up and show it to you. This nail came from Italy, and you may remember, if you have a long memory, that during the pontificate of John Paul II, he had a day of prayer in Assisi to which he invited religious leaders from around the world. And they all came to Assisi for a day. And there were photographs of them standing on a platform that had been built for them, all these men in their various religious garbs. Well, I have a sister who's a Franciscan, and she was living in Assisi at the time. And she went to the church the day after this event, just to be there and to pray. And while she was there, the workmen came and they started to dismantle this stage. And they were using, you know, the claws of their hammers and yanking the nails out and just kind of letting them fly. So this plink, 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 plink was going on all around her, which was distracting her. But then she began to give her attention to it. And eventually scurried around and picked up some of these nails as souvenirs. And on the day that I was installed as the president of my regional community, she gave me one of these nails. And she said, for the next 4 years, you're going to be standing on the stage a lot. But the stage that you stand on is held up by so many people. And keep this nail close to you so that you'll always remember that. That you'll know that during this time, you'll be in the spotlight. but you're only there because of the efforts and the dedication and the devotion of so many other people. So to you who are leaders in our Mercy schools, I offer that story, a story of gratitude to all of the people who back you up, all of the people who create this, the substrate on which you stand when you stand as leader in the school. Don't ever forget to be grateful to them and to encourage them and to let them know what a value they are to you and to our Ministry of Education. So I'm going to stop there and ask if you have any reflections or questions, or if you want to stand up and run around the room a little bit before we move into the last section.
Two things that were floating through my mind. One is, as you were telling that last story, Corky Raven's picture came in my head.
Yeah.
And her saying, her saying that whatever's accomplished, it's not you alone, it's everybody around you and people who've gone before you is the only way and reason you can do anything. Exactly. So I think that's very similar to what you were saying. The other is, and I'm not sure I'm using the right word here, what you said, but when that Catherine began the order to give permanence to the ministry.
Right.
So, it's like, okay, the mission, for me, that means the mission is more important than the structure, I think. So as we look at, and this is more of a pondering of mine, and it periodically comes up, it's like just in our world today, what structure do we need to have or need to let go of sometimes, so that the mission of education and in the education, I mean, I think the importance for Catherine of not just the education of, math, reading, writing, but religious instruction so intertwined with that, but keeping that true essence. What is the structure we need for today in our world or wherever our school is located to be able to do what she really called us to do and not get caught in a structure.
Right. And not get caught in her story.
Right.
Not be confined by the fact that she did it this way. This is how she responded.
Sheila, I so agree with that not to get caught in her story, because it's so often when you talk about Mercy Charism, they want to go back to, well, what did Catherine do? Which is very, very important to do. But what Catherine did was to look at what are the needs of the times, so she was able to help us to understand that we had to do the same. But what I wanted to say was that within the last couple of weeks, I have been working with the cohort of religion teachers as well as the cohort for campus ministers. And what we have been trying to do is unpack, what do we mean by mercy spirituality? And really what you are talking about is the whole integration of prayer and action, contemplation and service that really is the hallmark of what mercy spirituality is. So I'm so grateful for a lot of the words that you're using and examples and things to be able, because that's I think what has to continue in our schools, that it's not just that we are academic institutions that are, excelling in what we are doing with the education of our students, but that whole integration of what we are doing is we are doing it because mercy is calling us to it, so it's
I really think the integration of contemplation and action is the heart of everything. The heart of the way Catherine lived her life and that she calls us to live.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Any other comments or questions? Okay, anybody needs to stand up? I have a colleague who says on these Zoom meetings, feel free to move about the cabin. Do what you need to do. So I'm going to shift then to some stories about the kind of leader that Catherine was. What I mean when I talk about mercy leadership. And to start with, going back to the years when she lived with the Callahans that I mentioned earlier. This was a 20-year period in her life, very formative period, and particularly significant for the way she formed the Sisters of Mercy was the fact that Catherine Callahan was a member of the Society of Friends. Now, I'm never going to be able to prove this. I was so hoping that when they were renovating Bagot Street, somebody would break through a wall and out would fall all these notebooks of Catherine that talked about how she integrated Quaker principles into the, that didn't happen, but it's very clear to me. And from two perspectives. One is that the central tenet of the Society of Friends is there is that of God in every person. The belief that God dwells in each person, therefore the consummate dignity of every person, which is at the heart of Catherine's ministry and what she calls us to as part of the Mercy family. And the other was the equality of sexes within the Society of Friends. So that while there were separate experiences of Quaker worship, for instance, the voice of the men's meeting and the voice of the women's meeting were equal in importance. The significance of that to us is that when Catherine founded the community, and probably even before the community, she created a governance structure which depended on the voice of every person. So we have these stories about her when some significant decision needed to be made, of gathering that group of women around her and hearing the voices of all of them in terms of, should we accept the invitation to go to this place? Who will we send? Who will be the leader? So, Catherine could have claimed to make all these decisions herself. She was the founder. She was the leader. It was her money that was supporting what was going on. And yet she never placed herself above the women who had come to join her. She respected the opinion of each, and she acknowledged the voice of God's Spirit speaking through each one of them. And as a leader, she created an environment in which each member of the group felt that their contribution was significant and welcome and important to the unfolding of their future together. It's even more amazing when you realize that Catherine was significantly older than all of these women. She's in her 50s at this point, and they're like 18, 19, 20 years old. So even just in terms of life lived, she was so far ahead of them. And yet she was always willing to be guided by the fresh energy and the new insight. And she entrusted to them the future of the community that she created. It was an astounding act of empowerment. Carmel Burke, who's an Australian Sister of Mercy, gone to God now, wrote a wonderful little book about Catherine called A Woman Sings of Mercy. And she sums this up well in this quotation. She delegated authority to her sisters, freeing them to act on their own initiatives. When she missioned them to distant places, she never ceased to love and support the sisters, at the same time enabling them to develop their own skills and initiatives, giving them freedom and trust to judge for themselves the local situations and needs. She had no desire to fashion replicas of herself, but built on the uniqueness, on the pluses and minuses of each person, and she never smothered them. No expectation that they would be her. Instead, an expectation that they would be exactly who they were, but guided by her spirit. An example of this is in the story of Elizabeth Moore. Elizabeth is one of these early women. And when the invitation came for the Sisters of Mercy to establish a convent in Limerick, that group of women gathered together, chose Elizabeth Moore to be the leader. And Elizabeth drew herself up to her full height and bravely accepted this, this mission. So off they went to Limerick. And the tradition was that Catherine would go with each founding group and she would stay with them for 30 days while they got the house set up and the ministries established and everything. So a year later, Catherine receives from Elizabeth Moore, excuse me, I said that backwards. Elizabeth received from Catherine a letter in response to something that Elizabeth had sent her, expressing concern that Catherine might be disgruntled by something that a sister in Limerick had written to her. Catherine responds, "Never suppose you can make me feel displeasure by giving any opinion that occurs to you." It's an amazing liberty for a superior to, thought I was going to make it through tonight, to give to one of the sisters. And then after extending that liberty, she says to Elizabeth, "I ought to tell you all that could animate and comfort you, for you are a credit and a comfort to me. Every week I hear all that is edifying and respectable of your institution." This is 1 year after the founding. So here's the founding story. They get to Limerick. It's almost 30 days. It's time for Catherine to leave, but she wrote to somebody, "I can't go." Can't go for a full more than a month. No person of less experience could manage. As to Sister Elizabeth, with all her readiness to undertake it, we never sent forth such a faint-hearted soldier now that she's in the field. She gets as white as death. And to meet with the bishop or conclude with the sister, you might as well send the child that opens the door. But she's well liked, and I expect that things will go on well. So poor Elizabeth. She's very brave about taking the assignment in Limerick, but she gets there and she's really very scared of all the responsibility that is about to be hers. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but sometimes, you know, when you're not feeling all that sure of yourself, you're not at your very best. And Elizabeth in this situation was not at her very best. And Catherine found her to be stiff and sometimes kind of severe as a superior. And she hung around as long as she could. She stayed 3 months in Limerick, and then she finally had to go. But in the end, she wrote a poem to Elizabeth. And this is one of the things that I love dearly about Catherine, that when she had something difficult to say to someone, she often put it in the form of a verse that kind of took the sharp edges off it. And in this case, didn't even sort of give it to Elizabeth and say, "Read this and we'll discuss it," but left it behind for her to find. So I want to read to you what she said to Elizabeth because it's such good management advice. We've given this poem, this poem, the title, "Advice to Superiors." Don't let crosses vex or tease. Try to meet all with peace and ease. Notice the faults of every day, but often in a playful way. And when you seriously complain, let it be known to give you pain. Attend to one thing at a time. You've 15 hours from 6 to 9. Be mild and sweet in all your ways. Now and again bestow some praise. Avoid all solemn declaration, all serious, close investigation. Turn what you can into a jest, and with few words dismiss the rest. Keep patience ever at your side. You'll need it for a constant guide. Show fond affection every day, and above all, devoutly pray that God may bless the charge he's given and make of you their guide to heaven. The parting advice of your ever affectionate MCM. Well, what wonderful advice for a young leader. Be calm and peaceful and sometimes playful. Focus on what you're doing at the moment. Offer praise. Don't take everything too seriously. But when things are indeed serious, treat them with appropriate gravity. Be patient. Show your affection to those you're leading. I think this line, attend to one thing at a time, you 15 hours from 6 to 9, is mindfulness. I'm claiming that Catherine is an early practitioner of mindfulness. One other example from the life of Elizabeth Moore is, Catherine's father was kind of a contractor, and she had a lot of experience, not only with supervising the building of the house at Bagot Street, but with renovation of some other convents. And she went to visit Limerick at one point, and Elizabeth was thinking of some renovations, and she showed Catherine what she had in mind. So Catherine comes home and she wrote to Elizabeth, and she had her own ideas of what would be a good thing to do. So in this letter, she says, well, think about, breaking through this wall and putting a door here and shoving this wall back a little bit. And she has all these ideas. But then she says, look at it with all your brains and you'll soon make a great improvement. Catherine can see in her mind's eye exactly how the renovation could be done. But she tells Elizabeth to look at it with all her brains. She leaves Elizabeth free to make her decisions. She respects the authority that is hers as the leader of that local community. And she knows the way to become a confident decision maker is to make decisions and then to deal with the consequences of those decisions, be they positive or negative. Well, if you're wondering how Elizabeth did as the leader in Limerick, I can tell you that she was there for 30 years. And when she died, the newspaper described her as possessing a gentleness that never wounded, firmness that never relaxed when duty commanded resolution, subdued ardor that ever invigorated without exciting, grand hope that was never confounded, charity that embraced every evil and individual, thoughtful providence that in all the magnitude and multiplicity of labors and projects comprehended all things and never failed in anything, and noble majesty. This is what became of the little girl that was afraid to open the door. And I'm willing to bet that Elizabeth's great success was possible, partly at least, because Catherine showed how completely she believed in her and created the context in which Elizabeth could come to believe in herself. All early evidence to the contrary, Catherine trusted that the decision to make Elizabeth the leader in Limerick was the right one. And Elizabeth responded to that trust with courage and energy. In the quote that I read earlier from Carmel Burke, she says that Catherine knew the pluses and minuses of each person. She had the confidence, given the right amount of support and encouragement, that the pluses would win out. And with Elizabeth Moore, we find in Catherine a leader who was patient and empowering, who did not easily give up on someone, but who created the circumstances in which a young leader could thrive. A second story has to do with Claire Augustine Moore, who was an extraordinarily talented artist in the early community. And Claire Augustine would go out by day to do the work that all of the sisters were doing, visiting the sick poor and the hospitals and teaching in the school. But Catherine also gave her the assignment of illuminating a number of community documents. And Claire said about that work, and if you ever have the opportunity to visit Bagot Street, you can see how amazing this work is. Catherine, however, did not, I'm going to say, did not appreciate the painstaking intricacy of designing and creating such beautiful documents. And she would get really impatient with Claire Augustine, and she would go in and out of the studio to see if any work was being done. And we know this because Catherine blew off all this steam in letters to Frances Ward. So in one of them, she wrote, "Indeed, you can have no idea how little work she does in a week. As to a day's work, it is laughable. She will show me 3 leaves saying, 'I finished these today.' 3 leaves." So Claire would be working away with her painting, and Catherine would be coming in and out to see if anything was getting done, boiling over with frustration. But the interesting thing is that when Claire Augustine tells this story, she says, "Mother Catherine loved to watch me work." Whatever impatience or irritation Catherine was feeling at what she considered terribly slow work, Claire received it as interest and delight. An important lesson about leadership. Catherine may have been bubbling over with all this impatience and frustration at what she considered the slowness of Claire's process. She may not have appreciated the laboriousness of it, but she never let Claire see that. Catherine understood, I think, that just because she didn't have an appreciation for the process, that didn't mean that it wouldn't ultimately bring the desired results. And we know that she didn't allow her feelings to deter her support for Claire, because Catherine saw to it that she had the finest materials with which to work. Fine paper, fine paints, fine brushes. It's because of that generosity of spirit that we have these amazing documents in such wonderful condition today. Sometimes the leader needs to provide the necessary environment and materials, put their preferences and feelings aside, and get out of the way. At other times, a leader is called to shape the mood around a certain set of events or circumstances. Take, for instance, the story of Mary Ann Doyle. The sisters in the early days spent a year and a half, I think, nursing cholera victims at the Townsend Street Hospital, the Townsend Street Depot. And they went in shifts and worked to the point of exhaustion. And Mary Ann Doyle used to scuttle along on her knees between the cots of the patients. And she got a serious, very serious inflammation of her knees, which was quite painful. And this is another example where to someone who's in a difficult situation, Catherine tried to soften the situation with a verse. "Dear Sister Doyle, accept from me for your poor suffering martyrs a laurel wreath to crown each knee in place of former garters. Since fatal cholera appeared, you've scarce been seen to stand, nor dangered to yourself ere feared as death o'erspread the land. While on your knees from bed to bed you quickly moved about, it did not enter in your head that knees could e'er wear out. You've hurt the marrow to the bone, imploring aid and pity. And every cardinal in Rome would say, you saved the city. Now that the story of your fame in annals may be seen, we'll give each wounded knee a name, cholera and cholerine." Similar circumstance occurred in Birr. They were asked to make a foundation in Birr in December of 1840. Birr is in the Midlands in Ireland, so very dank and damp and cold. And on their first day there, Catherine walked a long distance to visit an elderly couple whose son had died. And her habit got soaked with mud and snow up to the knees. And it was flannel, and all they had was turf fire to dry it. And so she couldn't wear it. She wore her housecoat inside out as her habit. She wrote a lot of letters home from Birr, and she talks about the only way they could melt the butter was to sit it right on top of a burning turf. One of the sisters broke a tooth trying to eat her oatmeal. You know, she's creating this really not totally inaccurate picture of the circumstances, but it's from Birr that she wrote Dance Every Evening. And across the bottom of the letter, dance every evening with all these musical notes. And we often look at that and say, wow, they were having a good old time in Burr, weren't they? I think the dance every evening was about getting warm before getting into bed between cold, damp sheets. So it's another example of a leader who, in the midst of harsh circumstance, works at creating fun, and who knows that a little nonsense can go a long way when everything is conspiring to dampen your spirits. One final story has to do with how Catherine nurtured relationships. We saw how she fostered respect and trust among the young women who came to work with her in those circles, an atmosphere of friendship and loving playfulness. And once she had sent these women out to the various foundations that she made, she kept these relationships strong and created new relationships in fresh ways. First of all, she visited them, traveling by coach and canal boat to encourage them. Secondly, she wrote letters, and she used these missives not only to renew her own relationships with the sisters, but to keep them all connected to one another. So to the sisters in Tullamore, she wrote the news of Galway. And to the sisters in Limerick, she wrote the news of Charleville. She created webs of relationships, very much like we saw I think very much like we see in something like the Mercy Education System of America, webs of relationship, webs of support, webs of connection, webs of collaboration. The fact that her efforts were appreciated and imitated is seen in a quotation from the Bishop of Cork, who said, "It's impossible for the Order of Mercy to fail where there's such unity and affectionate interest as brings them 100 miles to aid and encourage one another." Wouldn't they be amazed at the ground we cover today, huh? Well, from all these examples, we find in Catherine a leader who enabled her companions and fostered an awareness of the importance of the contribution made by each one, who delegated authority and responsibility, but who was always ready to lend a wise ear and a supportive presence, who was patient and encouraging with the unfolding of a new leader's skill, who didn't give up on them, who knew when to be playful and when to be serious, who respected the decisions and the talents of others, even when she didn't understand them. We have at Carlo a set of the spiritual and corporal works of mercy that I find really interesting, and I'm going to read them to you. Be a good listener and help others to know how good they are. Share your advice and experience gently. Challenge the things that you know are wrong and let others know that there are better choices. Give others and yourselves room to make a mistake. I think these sound amazingly like Catherine's leadership skills. Leadership from a merciful space as a work of mercy is maybe a thought worth pursuing. So all of these attributes that I have highlighted from the life of Catherine are important qualities for a leader, but not the most important. The most important one is that she loved the people that she led. And she drew them into the sphere not only of her love, but of her motivations. For all that she did was fueled by God's mercy as she had experienced it, and from a desire to see that mercy revealed more and more in our world. There was an ever-widening space in her named mercy, carved out by the suffering that she experienced around her, which overflowed on 19th century Ireland and continues to overflow on us. For Catherine, the witness of her father's compassion for persons who were poor, the experience of 20 years in a Quaker household, her suffering over the sufferings of those around her, All of these and many other experiences in her life opened up and shaped the space from which she led. And all of us who are part of the Mercy family are encouraged to let our own lives teach us in the same way, to pay attention to the events which shape us in particular ways, and the kind of spaces that these events carve out in us. We are urged to look into that space and to name the motivations which reside there, those things that make us the unique leaders that we are. Hopefully, one of our motivations is the desire to see mercy revealed more and more in our world, just as it was Catherine's. Hopefully, we can reach into that space and draw from it the energy and the courage, the compassion and playfulness, the patience and trust, the respect and love that we need to be wise, effective, and caring leaders. Hopefully, all of us will seize the challenge presented by our tradition and by our aching world to lead from a merciful space. Amen. Any questions, comments?
Sister, throughout the whole presentation, I just kept taking notes of all of the, there's so many powerful words that you used for Catherine that are literally in 2022 still so prevalent in our schools. And one of the last things you said is she loved the people she led. And isn't that our hope for any mercy leader or any leader, to love the people and respect the people that she led? And I also loved when you said how patient and empowering she was. The story about the artist really just touched me, you know, as leaders. And I'm sure when you were, you know, leading your whole big group, there were people who would frustrate you, but the way that you attended to them was always so important. So there were so many beautiful things to think about. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you, Susan.
You know, I also think of, you know, your reflections around the web of relationship, and you alluded to Mercy Education, and I think, you know, we're just in a few short months we'll celebrate our 5th anniversary.
Is that right?
Which just seems like we just started, but it will be our 5th at July 1. And I think from the beginning of really, and what we continue to hear today from one another is how we can be of support for each other. It's that collaboration. And, you know, often when, and this is, again, culturally, it's so true of our international schools, that the first thing we talk about is relationship. What's going on in their school? What's, you know, what's happening in their life? And then we get to whatever the business of the meeting might have been. We get to it, for the schools in the US, it's business first, then we get to that. But it's that those sharings about what is happening in their schools is just so important. And I think people really desire to hear that from one another, and to gain strength and support from each other.
Sister Sheila, Mary Lee Robinson from Mercy High School, Baltimore, Board of Trustees. And I just want to thank you for sharing all of the stories and anecdotes. I thought it was a really interesting way to hear about Catherine McAuley and many of the ways that she led. And, you know, I was really touched to hear everything that you had to say. And thank you. And I'm really glad I was able to make it tonight.
Good. Thanks, Mary Lee. We're so lucky to have a woman as our founder who 200 years later remains so engaging and so relevant to what we're doing. That's not the case of every Charism group. Sue and I were talking about this before the rest of you arrived, you know, the relevance of Catherine. And I was thinking of, in Pittsburgh, we have 13 mother houses. And the sisters used to meet fairly often. And somebody said to me once, "You Mercies talk about Catherine McAuley like she's coming to lunch." Which was not the experience of anybody else in the group. Well,
We wish she could, right?
yeah.
But sister, we really want to thank you, especially for sharing the stories and relating so much of what Catherine did to our world. Thank you for fighting through your cough. We hope that you continue to feel stronger. And it is special people like you who have studied Catherine, who lives her life each day. And we can't thank you enough for the time that you have spent with our leaders and with Mercy Education.
Thank you, Sue. And I let the last word be thanks to you for all that you're doing to sustain and enliven our Mercy ministry in today's world.
We're
We are
honored to do that.